You've been taught that what matters in office politics is what you say. Choose the right words, stay calm, sound confident. Nobody ever told you the second thing being measured in that room, how long you wait before you say it. The half second between a question and your answer isn't empty. In every performance review, every stand-up, every quick chat with your manager, that gap is being read, and it's being read against you, not the words that come after it, the gap itself. By the end of this video, you're going to hear that gap every time it happens to you for the rest of your career. That's not a comfortable thing to promise. It's an accurate one. Here's what everyone gets told instead. You're just nervous. Work on your confidence. Practice more. That explanation is convenient because it puts the problem inside you. Something you're supposed to fix alone, quietly, without anyone in the room changing anything about how they listen. Here's what's actually happening. The room is running an unconscious scoring system on your timing, and it has almost nothing to do with your words. It's older than you, older than the company, and nobody in that meeting designed it on purpose, which is exactly why nobody can turn it off, including the people using it against you. The system isn't broken. It's working precisely the way human listening has always worked. It was just never built to be fair to you specifically, and no one in office politics is going to be the one to point that out. So this video will. I'm not guessing about this, and I'm not a career coach who picked this topic because it performs well. I'm an audiologist, specialized in auditory processing and active listening, how the human ear and brain actually process timing, hesitation, and vocal signal. Clinically, I use that training to understand how people process sound and speech for a living. The reason I'm telling you this isn't credentials for their own sake. It's that everything in this video is the same material I work with in a clinical setting, pointed at a room you sit in every week without any of the training I have. Your manager doesn't know why a 2-second pause makes them uneasy. They just feel it, and they act on the feeling. And that gap between feeling and understanding is exactly where you keep losing ground you never knew was being contested. Let's start with what's true. Physiologically, underneath all of this, a pause before you answer a real question. Not a yes or no, not something rehearsed, an actual question that requires you to retrieve and organize an answer, is processing time. It is your brain doing the accurate, careful version of the task you were just asked to do. Under about half a second, that processing reads as normal. Nobody notices it. It doesn't register as a gap at all. Push past roughly a second, though, and something changes on the listening side. Not on yours. The listener's brain, which has been idling in a kind of low-grade prediction mode the entire time you're not talking, stops predicting and starts explaining. It needs a reason for the silence. And because it doesn't have access to what's actually happening in your head, it invents one. This is not a flaw in you. It is a structural fact about how listening works, and it applies to everyone in the room equally. The difference is that only one side of that exchange is being evaluated for it. Human listening is not a passive process. It's predictive. While you're speaking, the listener's brain is constantly generating a guess about what you're going to say next, updating it word by word, and that predictive machinery doesn't switch off the instant you stop talking. It looks for the next input to grab onto. Silence, to a predicting brain, isn't neutral. It's a gap that needs an explanation. And the explanations that come fastest are rarely generous ones. Picture the scenario. You're in a review. Your manager asks why a project slipped. The honest answer requires you to hold 3 things in your head at once: the vendor delay, the scope change nobody documented, and the fact that you personally caught the error 2 weeks before it became visible. That takes 1.5 seconds to organize into a sentence that doesn't sound like an excuse. In that 1.5 seconds, your manager's brain has already generated 3 or 4 candidate explanations for your silence, and none of them are, they're doing careful, accurate work. The fast, cheap explanations are things like, they don't have a good answer. They're deciding what to admit to. They weren't paying attention to this project closely enough to answer instantly. By the time your actual accurate answer arrives, it's landing on top of an impression that already formed without it. This is the part nobody explains to you when they tell you to just be more confident. Confidence doesn't shorten your processing time. It just makes you more willing to speak before you finish the process, which is a different and much riskier trade. This shows up in 3 places at work more than anywhere else, and they compound on each other over a career in ways that are almost invisible while they're happening. The first is the performance review. This is the highest stakes version because it's the one place where someone is actively, deliberately forming a written judgment about you while you're talking. If you're asked to account for a miss and you pause to answer honestly, that pause gets folded into the narrative your manager is already building, often before you've said a single word of your actual answer. Weeks later, in a calibration meeting you're not in, seemed defensive when asked about the Q2 miss can end up in a summary that was actually generated by 2 seconds of silence, not by anything you said. The second is being challenged in a meeting in front of other people. This one has an extra layer because now the pause isn't just being read by the person who challenged you, it's being read by everyone else in the room simultaneously, each running their own version of the same predictive machinery. A pause that would be unremarkable one-on-one becomes a small public event with an audience, and the social pressure of being watched tends to make people either freeze longer, which reads as worse, or rush an answer they haven't finished forming, which reads as worse in a different way. There's no version of take your time that a room full of people watching you actually rewards, even when they say the words out loud. You know the exact shape of this moment even if you've never thought about it in these terms. Someone pushes back on a number in your slide. Everyone's eyes move to you at the same time. The honest answer requires you to check your own logic before you defend it out loud. A half second of real verification, not hesitation, but with 6 people watching, that half second stretches, socially, into something that feels much longer than it is. What actually gets remembered afterward isn't the verification, it's the stretch. The third is salary negotiation and promotion conversations, and this is the one with the longest tail. If you've ever quietly asked yourself, why am I not getting promoted when the work is clearly there? This is very often part of the real answer. You are, in that exact conversation, being asked to advocate for yourself, to state your value out loud, often for the first time in months. If that statement comes with a pause, because you're doing the very reasonable thing of trying to phrase your own worth accurately instead of reciting a memorized script, that hesitation gets read as uncertainty about your own case, not as care, as doubt. And a negotiator who sounds uncertain about their own number rarely gets the number. Walk through how this actually plays out. You're asked, so what number were you thinking? You know the market range, you know your case. But stating an exact figure out loud to someone who controls a decision about your income is a genuinely different act than thinking that figure privately. And your brain treats it that way, which costs you real processing time before the number comes out. In that pause, the person across the table isn't thinking they're being careful with a significant figure. Most of the time they're thinking they're not sure this number is defensible, and they will use that read, consciously or not, as room to counter lower than they would have otherwise. The irony is exact. The more the number actually matters to you, and the more precisely you're trying to get it right, the longer the pause, and the more that pause quietly works against the number landing. Notice the pattern across all 3. In every case, the pause happens because you're doing something harder and more careful than the alternative, accounting honestly for a miss, thinking before speaking under social pressure, trying to state your value with precision instead of a rehearsed line. The system doesn't just fail to reward that, it actively scores it as the opposite of what it actually is. So the obvious next move is Eliminate the pause. Answer faster. Here's where it gets genuinely unfair, in a way that's worth sitting with for a second, because this is the part that traps people for years. If you shorten the gap by actually thinking faster, by over-preparing every possible question in advance so you never need real-time processing, you can do that for maybe the first 18 months of a role, and it's exhausting in a way that doesn't show up on any performance metric. Eventually, a question comes that you didn't rehearse, and you're back to square one, except now you're more anxious about the pause than you were before because you've spent months treating it as a weakness to be eliminated instead of a normal part of thinking. If instead you shorten the gap by answering before you've actually finished organizing the answer, filling the silence just to avoid the silence, the room gets a faster response, but a worse one. Rushed answers are more likely to contain the exact things that damage you in a review. An overcommitment you can't walk back, an admission stated more baldly than you meant it, a number picked because it came out fast rather than because it was right. You've traded a 2-second silence, which cost you a slightly worse first impression, for a sentence you'll be dealing with for months. This is the actual double bind. Pause and your read is uncertain. Rush and you generate the exact content that confirms uncertainty was the right read. Almost nobody explains this trade-off to you directly, because almost nobody in that room has thought about it in these terms. They just have a gut feeling about who sounds sharp, and that gut feeling was built on a rule that punishes accuracy and rewards speed, regardless of which one the moment actually calls for. Here's the layer that makes this a systemic issue, and not just a communication tip, and it's the part that turns this from here's a quirky fact about listening into something closer to what's actually happening in office politics. The exact same length of pause from two different people in the exact same meeting does not get scored the same way. Someone who has already banked a reputation for being sharp, usually because of tenure, title, or simply having been right loudly and publicly a few times, gets that pause read charitably. It becomes, they're being thoughtful. They're not the type to just say the first thing. The silence gets filled in with the listener's existing good opinion of them. Someone without that banked reputation yet, someone newer, someone junior, someone who's already fighting an uphill perception battle for reasons that have nothing to do with this meeting, gets the same length of silence read as confirmation of exactly the doubt the room already half suspected. The gap doesn't get filled with a generous story, because there's no existing generous story on file to draw from. It gets filled with the cheapest, closest at hand explanation, which is rarely a flattering one. This is why two people can attend the identical meeting, use the identical amount of processing time before answering the identical question, and walk out having been scored in opposite directions. It's not about the pause. The pause is just the surface where an existing, unspoken judgment about who gets the benefit of the doubt becomes visible, timed to the millisecond, in a way almost nobody in the room could actually articulate if you asked them directly. Picture it side by side, because the contrast is where this becomes obvious. Someone with 10 years in the building gets asked a hard question in a leadership sync. They pause. Someone down the table actually fills the silence for them. Yeah, take your time, it's a real question. And when the answer comes, it's received as considered. Nobody writes anything down about the pause. It doesn't exist as data. It was absorbed into a reputation that was already solid enough to carry it. The newest person on that same team gets asked a comparably hard question 3 weeks later. Same room, same rough pause length. Same tone of voice. Nobody fills the silence for them. A couple of people glance at their laptops. When the answer finally lands, someone's already half decided it took too long to arrive, and that half decision quietly attaches itself to how the rest of the answer gets received, even though the actual content was just as sound. Nobody in that second meeting would say out loud that they scored the pause differently because of tenure. Almost none of them would even notice they did it. But the tape, if you had one, would show the identical gap treated as two different facts. None of this means you start performing a fix. If you try to manufacture a shorter pause or fake a warmer, faster cadence that isn't natural to how you actually think, it reads as exactly what it is, a performance. And now you've added a second signal working against you on top of the first. People are better at detecting manufactured ease than they are at detecting genuine hesitation, which is the opposite of what most advice on this subject assumes. What actually changes is smaller, and it happens in your head, not in your delivery. You stop treating the 2 seconds before you speak as dead time you owe the room an apology for. That gap was never evidence against you. It was accurate processing happening in a room that was never built to recognize it as such. And now that you know the scoring exists, you can tell the difference in real time between a pause that's actually costing you something and a pause you're simply anxious about because you've been trained to be. That distinction matters more than any delivery technique. Once you can name what's happening, this is a 2-second pause being misread as doubt. And I know that, and the content of my answer is sound. You stop adding a second layer of visible anxiety on top of the original, invisible one. And it's that second layer, the anxiety about the anxiety, that actually reads worst of all. Take that away, and the same length of pause, from the same you, starts landing differently. Not because you eliminated it, but because you stopped fighting it in a way that showed. The room will keep scoring the pause. It was always going to. This isn't a habit anyone's going to individually unlearn, because almost nobody knows they're doing it in the first place. The only thing that actually changes is whether you're the one person in that meeting who knows the scoring exists while it's happening to you. That's the whole trade this channel is going to keep making with you. Not motivational language, not a script to perform, just the actual mechanism, named clearly enough that you can recognize it the next time you're sitting in that half second of silence, deciding whether to trust it. If this is the first time someone's actually put words to something you've been sensing in every one of these meetings for years, it won't be the last thing this channel names for you. Subscribe if you want to keep hearing what the room isn't saying out loud.